Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Biodiversity Conservation. It's April 27th, and I'm really mixing it up this week by putting my face on the other side of the slides. I hope that keeps things really sharp for you guys. I don't know how you're doing. I'm getting a little bit bored with the online teaching. I really miss seeing all of you in person, and I really enjoyed the Wednesday classes when everybody can log in at 1 o'clock to hear me introduce the workshop in person. So I encourage more of you to come. I've had about 10 people coming every week, which is great. But for those of you who aren't logging in, I miss seeing you and I'd love to check in. So this Wednesday, we have a workshop as usual, and at 1 o'clock, I'll have the same workshop introduction live on Zoom. And all you do is just click on the Zoom link right under Wednesday's day on Moodle, and you'll be in the Zoom. And I always record that and put it up for people who can't make it, but it would be great to see you guys there in person. So in any case, today we are doing conservation in human modified landscapes, a topic that's very near and dear to my heart because it's what most of my master's and PhD research was on. And so you're going to watch this lecture video, then you're going to watch the second video, making biodiversity work on modern farms, and then do the mini assessment. Okay, so the fun's over because I have to move my head back over here. So this whole idea, conservation in human modified landscapes, kind of kicks off the theme that we're going to be talking about for the last few weeks of the semester, which is really, what's the role of people in conservation? And how can we conserve biodiversity in a world that's increasingly dominated by people? So the original idea of conservation, when we wanted to mark off areas and say that they were parks and people had to stay out, or if people already lived there, people had to get out. We had to remove them from those places, as you saw in some of the videos we watched a couple weeks back about Indigenous rights and land management. So there's been many times in the history of modern day Western conservation biology where parks have been established, and they're really only established where no people are living, or we kick the people out to then say they're a park. But as human populations grow and time goes on, it really becomes very, very difficult to say we'll only protect pristine areas, because what is pristine really? So as we learn more about humans and the impact we've had on the landscape over time, we're learning that it's not just since the Industrial Revolution that humans have modified landscapes. We've modified landscapes since we evolved, right? Since we evolved about 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens evolved. And then about 10,000 years ago, agriculture started in many different places on Earth at almost the same time. It's very interesting. So we don't have time today to talk about the origins of agriculture. That's something we talk about in my sustainable ag class. But you can see this is from your book, and I like how this graphic kind of shows us the idea that some of these untouched regions of Earth have actually been heavily modified by humans in the past. So they're calling it evidence of human modification of pristine tropical rainforests. And the central Amazon, like Brazil, which we think of as like this pristine rainforest landscape, it actually, studies have shown that many of the soils in the Amazon were actually created intentionally by humans as they used agricultural practices of building up the ashes from their fires to build up these really carbon-rich soils that they would plant trees that grew food in high concentrations on these soils. So they were still native trees, but they were creating these soils in order to grow the trees and plants that they gave them more food. So these soils are still in evidence today. And there's some other examples on there that you can look into as well. But essentially, agriculture has been happening on the planet since 10,000 years ago, right? So excuse me, actually 12,000 years ago, 10,000 BC it was. So that's 12,000 years ago. And we have modified many of Earth's ecosystems through agricultural practices since at least 12,000 years ago. So, okay, what does pristine mean if people have been present in all these landscapes for long, long periods of time? Well, maybe we need to throw away the concept of pristine and start protecting biodiversity wherever we find it. So humans have modified most of the surface of the planet at this point. So let's look at that for a second. Now, this graphic, which I'll walk you through in a minute, covers global land use for food production. And the reason why we just jumped right to food production is because that's most of what we use land for. We use a little bit of it for urban. It might seem like cities are huge and take up so much space, but they actually take up very little space in terms of the surface of the earth. It's food production that takes up most of our space. So there's 150 million square kilometers on Earth that are habitable, excuse me, that are land. So the rest of it's ocean. My head is hiding that. And then of that land, 71% of it is habitable. Like in theory, people could live there. The rest of it is glaciers or barren land, like it says in there, deserts, salt flats, exposed rocks, beaches. You can't really live there. And then of that habitable land, 50% is already converted to agriculture, 50%. The other 37% is forest, you have 11% shrub, and then there's our little urban and built up land, 1%. So we're not taking up much space with our built up land. We're taking up a ton of space with our food production systems. 50%. Now, okay, you might say, well, we have 50% left, we can still plant agriculture on, but think back to your workshop a month or so ago when you had the option to transform the forest into agriculture. You know that the effects of transforming all the forests into agriculture is not completely benign. Sure, you produce more food, you can support more people, but you lose all of the ecosystem services that come along with that forest. So it's not really wise to just convert all habitable land on Earth into agriculture. So, okay, of that agricultural land, what are we mostly using it for? We are mostly using it to produce meat and dairy. So this, here I'm kind of veering off for a 1 minute, like get on my little, get up on the soapbox and preach about diet and its impact of the environment. Because essentially meat and dairy are the main ways that we use land. So look down at this bar right here. Of the 51 million square kilometers that we've converted to agriculture, 77% of that is to produce meat and dairy. And only 23% of it is used to produce crops. So what this 77% also includes, if you see down there, is animal feed production. So some of this land, it's also talking about crops that are planted to then feed to animals instead of to feed directly to people, right? But then let's look at what we do with 77% of that land. It actually only produces 18% of our calories, whereas 82% of our calories come from that little 23% that we're planting in vegetables. So I'll just walk you through that last one down there. Okay, but yeah, we all know meat is high in protein, meat and dairy. So 37% of our protein supply is coming from meat and dairy. But it's not like protein can't come from plant-based foods. If you look at that other part of the bar, 63% of our protein is from plant-based foods. So just my little takeaway from this is a meat-heavy diet has a very intense impact on the environment. And a vegetable-focused diet has a much lower impact. And if more people move towards a diet that was less focused on meat, not vegetarian necessarily, but less meat, we could use some of that 77% of the land that we're now using for livestock to grow vegetable crops to feed more people, or to put back into natural ecosystems for biodiversity. So if you're interested in that idea, you should take my sustainable agriculture class in the fall. We don't have time to talk more about that here, but let's see. So we know we've modified most of the Earth's surface, but so what if we said, okay, well, we'll just protect the wilderness areas that are left? Well, you guys last week looked at conservation planning and you looked at these templates for conservation planning, and at least one of those templates, the last of the wild, was based on, okay, where are the wilderness areas in the world and how can we identify them? Areas that have no roads or are a certain distance from roads and very little human habitation. Those are wilderness areas. We need to protect those. And if you look at that map, it's like, whoa, that's a lot of Earth. Okay, why don't we just protect that? And then we're protecting pristine areas. Well, as you also know from last week, those don't overlap with the high biodiversity areas. So this map, Mittermeier et al. 2004, that template was looking at biodiversity hotspots in terms of species richness. And that last map there from the World Wildlife Federation and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, that was looking at centers of plant diversity. So if you just look across those maps, some of the wilderness areas will match up with some of those diversity areas, but not all of them, right? Not even the majority. So we can't just protect wilderness areas. We need to protect landscapes that humans have already modified as well. What does protect mean in that situation? Well, we have to think of humans as part of the conservation picture. So here's a map again from your reading on anthropogenic biomes. So this is like a new way to look at, you can look at biomes as the ecosystem type that it is, like desert, Arctic tundra, savanna, tropical rainforest. But this is proposing that we look at biomes as through a human lens. So how have humans, what is this landscape? What ecosystem is it? And how have humans changed it? And you can see again here that dense settlements like urban areas and other suburban areas, it's not really a huge percentage of land. What is a huge percentage of land is croplands and rangelands. You can see that on there. So if humans are part of the conservation picture, then we need to think about conservation in these landscapes, right? So how can we make urban areas more biodiversity friendly? How can we make farms where crops are being grown more biodiversity friendly? How can we make rangelands more biodiversity friendly? And of course, how can we continue to protect wildlands while still allowing for traditional practices and protecting them from further development? So today, we're going to focus on these two, more really on crop cultivation than rangelands, but making them more, what are the issues with them not being friendly to biodiversity and how can we make them more biodiversity friendly? And then on Friday, I'm going to talk about making urban areas more biodiversity friendly. Wildlands, we've talked about, so they're obviously biodiversity friendly already, and we're really focusing on protection in human modified landscapes for this week. So we're not going to talk about wildlands this week. Okay, so first of all, if you're going to conserve, so agriculture is a business, right? You're either trying to just, if you're a smallholder, you're trying to make enough food to keep your family alive and also sell some to be able to get goods that you need, or you're like a more corporate farmer who's producing crops on a large scale and is making a profit. So why do we need biodiversity for that? Well, hopefully you guys already know the answer from our Ecosystem Services Week. But it's widely recognized that biodiversity is very important for agriculture. And I'm going to mention one reason that we haven't already talked about, which is that, so what is this picture of? It's a picture of all different kinds of carrots. Well, who cares? I only like those orange ones. I don't need a purple carrot. That's just fancy. Well, that's not completely true. You do need a purple carrot. Maybe not today, maybe not you personally, but the more diversity we have in our crops, the more different varietals of our crops we have saved and we know how to grow, the less likely it is that one disease or growth issue is going to take out our entire supply of that crop. So you may have heard, for example, of the Irish potato famine a couple hundred years ago. That was actually caused by the fact that the Irish, at that time, the Irish people were growing only 2 strains of potato, 2 cultivars. That's it. So no genetic diversity. The potato, of course, originated in South America, and there's tons and tons of diversity in potatoes. That you have potatoes of every shape, size, and color. But in Ireland at that time, they were just growing 2 round brown potatoes. And they were both susceptible to this potato blight that came in, and it killed all the potatoes. Now, many of the original potato cultivars in South America are not susceptible to that blight. So if the Irish people had been growing all different cultivars of potato, then the Irish potato blight would not have happened. So the point is, we need biodiversity in our actual crops. We need them to be not just one monoculture owned by Monsanto. But this is the part I was saying you should already know. We also know that ecosystems provide many ecosystem services to our agriculture. So what are some of these services? Nitrogen fixing, so that plant so nitrogen is a limiting compound for plant growth. Plants, if you've ever fertilized your plants at home and you look at that label, it says nitrogen and phosphorus, 2 of the things that you'll be using to fertilize your plants. And nitrogen fixing plants, like legumes and locust trees, these plants actually fix nitrogen into the soil. So soil enhancement through many measures, but primarily through nitrogen fixing is very important. Pest control, there's my favorite, the bat, and he's eating a moth, which was no doubt going to consume some delicious corn or some other kind of crop. And so natural pest control that's provided not just by bats, but by birds and any other predators of insects is invaluable for farmers, right? Pollination, we've talked about that one at length. And then this picture down here, soil enhancement. So you may not know this, but soil is filled with microorganisms and tiny little microinvertebrates and macroinvertebrates. And those are all very important for the soil ecosystem, and they allow healthy plants to grow. So if we kill our soil through applying pesticides and herbicides and chemical fertilizers, then the soil cannot provide that service anymore. So these are the reasons that we need biodiversity for agriculture. So what are some of the problems with our current agricultural systems? Why do we have to make them more biodiversity friendly? Well, these 2 pictures here, yes, they happened recently, but they represent more traditional agricultural systems. In traditional agricultural systems, so like for most of the 12,000 years that we've been engaging in agriculture as a species, we have had systems like these. Now this woman here on the left, she's working in a rice paddy, and she has an integrated farm where she is having livestock, those ducks, and rice in the same farm. The ducks, what they do is they swim around in the rice paddy and they eat the pests off of the rice shoots. But at the same time, then you can use the duck as a source of meat. So it's an integrated farming system. She's not spraying pesticides on the rice. She's letting the ducks, another livestock product, to get it off themselves. This man over here on the right, he's farming. He's not using fossil fuels to power his farm tools. He's using animals, right? Which can also be a source of meat. And if you look closely at his farm, he's growing multiple different crops right next to each other. So that's called intercropping. And it's much better if you look out at the forest or a field around your house, you don't see just one plant growing there, right? It's not a monoculture. It's a diverse array of many different plants. And we used to farm like that, many different crops mixed together in patches. And this is much more biodiversity friendly because it much more closely resembles a system that you would find in nature. So farms have changed a lot since we first developed agriculture. While there's still many farms out there like this, there's now many more farms that are using what I don't like to call it conventional farming. It's not conventional, it's not traditional, it's industrial. So what are the main problems with current agricultural systems? the problem is that most of them have transitioned to industrial farming. So they apply these pesticides, which, I mean, do you really want to eat that crop down there that those guys in the hazmat suits are spraying with pesticides? Doesn't seem safe. Excess nutrients, so fertilizer is really cheap. So farmers will put way more than they need on their crops and it'll get washed off into lakes and streams. And here, I'm sure you guys have all seen, you know, by mid-July, some of the lakes or ponds around your house will look like this one in the upper right. They're covered with algae because excess nutrients washing into the water causes these plants the algae to bloom. Not only is that ugly and gross, but it kills everything underneath it because none of the plants in the water can get access to the sunlight anymore. And that's called eutrophication. So some other issues, I'll move my head over here so you can see these horrifying pictures. Some other issues are irrigation. Okay, irrigation's not always bad, but when you're irrigating areas that are actually by nature very arid, then you're usually using groundwater, and that does not replenish as fast as we are using it. Irrigation also washes. So if you dump a ton of fertilizers, pesticides, whatever on your crops and then you irrigate it, you're washing a ton of that down into the local watershed. Monocultures. So I just mentioned this word a couple minutes ago, but if you look at that down there, if we were in class, I'd ask you, what's that plant? And maybe one of you would guess that it is pineapple. So this is the area where I worked on my PhD research on pineapple plantations in Costa Rica. And if you look at that pineapple through the eyes of an animal, does that look like an easy place to cross to get to the next rainforest patch you can see over the hill? Or does that look like a place you'd like to build a nest or forage? No, you can't even walk through there. It's really spiky and it hurts. So growing plants in monoculture is very unfriendly to biodiversity because it creates these like impenetrable oceans that wildlife can't use in any way or pass through to get to the next natural habitat area. So what about these last two? Okay, last one, overgrazing. So this is a major issue. This is a rangelands one. So, you know, this is a lot of the, let's see what it was, 77% of the 50% of land that we've converted to agriculture is for livestock. So either grazing or to grow crops to feed them. And when you run too many cattle on a range that the range can't withstand, there's really bad effects and there can be desertification. So what you see down here in this bottom picture is two patches of rangeland managed by two different owners. And the one on the left is overgrazing his land and the one on the right is not. And you can see the difference that makes. And up in the upper right, you can see that these cattle have overgrazed this area and it's right next to a river, so it's going to cause erosion of the soil down into the river, which makes it harder for plants to grow back, which increases desertification. So overgrazing is not biodiversity friendly or really long-term sustainable. So, all right, well, what's the problem? I mean, how many of the farms, like of the food you eat, that you'll eat today, how much of it is coming from these industrial farms? Probably most of it at this point. So these two graphs are a little hard to understand, but bear with me here. The graph on the left from the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, what that's saying is like, on average, how big are farms? So if you randomly picked one of the world's farms from a hat, how big would it be? Most of those farms, 72%, would be tiny, less than a hectare. A hectare is 100 meters by 100 meters. So those are tiny farms and they're owned by, you know, all the smallholders, many of them in developing countries, growing food just to support their families. Only 1% of farms on Earth are bigger than 50 hectares. 1%. Well, no problem then. There's not that many farms using these practices. So there is a problem because look over on the right. Because of the size of those farms, the actual amount of agricultural land controlled is like the complete opposite. So farmers who have less than 1 hectare farms are only controlling 8% of the world's agricultural land. Whereas farmers who have farms that are bigger than 50 hectares, often much, much bigger, like many hundreds of square miles, are 65% of the agricultural land on Earth. So the takeaway from this that I want you to understand is that most of the agricultural land on Earth is owned by large multinational industrial farms and is being farmed using industrial farming methods. Now, is this sustainable? No, because none of those practices that I just described are sustainable. They will not allow the system to keep providing the ecosystem services that the system needs. Are they profitable? Yes, for right now. But they'll become less profitable as they degrade the system. So we need to change something. I'm going to skip that for now. So we need to switch to a more sustainable agricultural system. And what I'm showing you here is like, okay, what the heck does sustainable agriculture mean? Does that just mean organic? No, not at all. It means an integrated system of plant and animal production practices that will, over the long term, satisfy human food and fiber needs, so it has to make enough food, enhance environmental quality, so it can't be harmful to the environment, make the most efficient use of non-renewable resources, and integrate, where appropriate, natural biological cycles and controls. So it's not saying don't use any fossil fuels, just saying where possible, replace non-fossil fuel-based techniques. Sustain the economic viability of farm operations and enhance the quality of life for farmers and society as a whole. So sustainable agriculture is about much more than just making room for biodiversity and conservation. It's about creating a dependable, sustainable, healthy food supply into the future. But we're going to focus on the biodiversity aspect of it this week. So what are some practices of sustainable agriculture that make it more friendly to biodiversity? Well, you can see up there in that picture, hopefully you're thinking, wow, that is not a monoculture. No, it is not. That farm that you see there, they're doing intercropping. So they're planting many different crops on the same land to create diversity in plants, right? Retain wildlife habitat at edges and along rivers and streams. So you can see down there in the valleys on this farm that there's, where the water probably is, that there's still forest. That reduces erosion and it retains like corridors for wildlife to travel along those forested areas. So this isn't illustrated on this picture, but rotational grazing, so graze cattle in a different place each season. Shade cropping for products like coffee, that creates more habitat for biodiversity and also reduces the need for pest management. So integrated pest management, that refers to a system whereby instead of spraying tons of pesticides and other chemicals, you actually introduce native predators of your insect pests, or you provide habitat for them. You will see a great example of this in the video that I provided for you to watch today. So in a nutshell, sustainable agriculture is obviously an entire course, but in a nutshell, it entails fewer inputs, like fewer pesticides and herbicides and etc., fewer fossil fuels, more substitution of natural systems, and basically this idea of trying to get your farm to resemble an ecosystem. Sustainable and biodiversity friendly does not have to mean low tech or small scale or you're losing money. Not at all. We don't have time to talk about this in class, but these structures using more sustainable practices can many times increase your yield and make you more money while still protecting biodiversity. So you'll see this in the video, and I actually didn't put a third video up there. I just put the one because I couldn't find another one that perfectly expressed what I wanted to show you. But that second video does do a really good job of showing you essentially how you can have an integrated pest management system on your farm and still make money, actually make more money than before you had that system. So that's all for today. So there's no additional reading for Wednesday. Our workshop on Wednesday will be you reading a little bit more about sustainable agricultural practices, and then putting yourself in the shoes of a coffee farmer in the tropics and trying to figure out how to maximize biodiversity while still making a profit on your coffee farm. So that should be fun. And I forgot that I just wanted to tell you that I mentioned it before, but this is the field where just most of my research has been in. So I did a lot of work down in Costa Rica and looked at how agricultural intensification, so the movement from traditional low input farming practices to high input industrial farming, how that affected biodiversity and how it affected social systems. So I'm really interested in this field, and if you ever want to discuss it more or pursue a research project on it, definitely get in touch with me because I continue to work on this now in our region. Okay, that's all for today. Thank you all and have a good rest of your day.